Hello, I'm conductor Raffaele Ponti, and this is Behind the Notes. Today, my very special guest is the amazing bassist, Larry Glazner. Larry, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Raffaele. How are you?
I'm well, sir. Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
Let's start from the very beginning. This is an incredibly beautiful career. And I want to know, did you come from a musical family, or was there one experience that got you involved in classical music?
Well, I had a very supportive family. Both my parents had studied piano, but I wouldn't say that I wouldn't call it a musical family. So I first played the cello in elementary school, in the school music program. And when I got to junior high school, I had a trumpet player friend, clarinetist friend, a guy who had a trap set. They said, you know, we want to have a little combo. There's a bass lying in the dressing room in the auditorium of the school. Do you think you could play it? So I started playing the bass with them a little bit, and then one thing led to another, and it just felt like, you know what, this suits me. And I would say it's that rhythmically, you know, the bass is so important, that was sort of my orientation. That's one of the reasons it just sort of grabbed me, you know.
That's wonderful. You know, I'm a firm believer that if we pick the right instrument, it's a success.
Right.
Or do you think the instrument picks us?
Yeah, it's funny. It just sort of happens. Things happen to line up. I mean, if these guys hadn't mentioned that, who knows what would have happened. And then after that, there was a summer program that was after my sophomore year in high school in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It was called the Governor's School. And at that point, I found out about the North Carolina School of the Arts, which had just started. And that summer, I thought this was another aligning where I said, you know, this is really fun. That was the first time I had actually played a symphony. It was Schubert III. It was my first symphony.
Wow.
And someone there told me about the School of the Arts. And so I went there my last 2 years of high school. So that was a sort of total immersion that helped make up for the fact that I really hadn't had a great background from an early age. I mean, I find myself, not anymore, but I found myself for a long time envious of friends who like grew up in Chicago or Philadelphia and were studying with Philadelphia Orchestra bass players from the outset, for instance. So that total immersion those last 2 years of high school meant that I really decided this is what I want to do, and it helped make up for anything I may have been lacking early on.
Fantastic. And what was the next step after that?
After that, it was the Cleveland Institute of Music, which you know about.
Right. I went there also.
Yeah. I would say there's one thing I remember about my Winston-Salem days, though. I played in the community orchestra, the Winston-Salem Symphony. One of the programs was unusual in that it wasn't a regular symphonic program. It was what we at the Met started calling opera highlights. It was a program of arias and duets. There was a tenor and a soprano. And I remember thinking, you know, this is really interesting playing because you have to wait a little bit. They're not singing it quite in tempo, and you have to wait and be ready to play. And that is, I think, one of the things that always intrigued me about the opera was the flexibility we had to have. So in Cleveland, I did 4 years there. Two different teachers whom you may remember, Jack Pozell, an older fellow who had been the principal years ago with Zell, and then Larry Angel. And then I went to New York with nothing definite in mind, but I ended up playing a lot of freelance things, and I played an American Symphony. And then Levine, James Levine, had been the conductor of the Cleveland Institute Orchestra, and he told the office at the Met that I was in New York. And I did a couple of substitute appearances at the Met. And then shortly thereafter was the first audition I took, for which I was the runner-up. And I was the first call sub, which worked out great because I ended up playing all the standard repertoire and learning my way around everything, and the guys all knew me. So when I got the job where I was playing on the first stand, it was a very easy transition for myself and for everyone else.
Wonderful. Wow.
Yeah.
Was Richard Crowman principal in Cleveland when you were there?
He was.
And Larry Angel was in the section at that point.
Larry Angel was the second player, yes. And then eventually, I think it was Dave Crowman. Dave Crowman had, I think, a brain.
Yeah, he fell ill.
It was terrible. Larry was principal after that. I think they moved.
Right, he did become principal at that, correct. Okay, great.
Kind of late in his career, you know.
So do you think that, because I think I regard those people like Crowman, Larry Angel, and your first teacher, those were really the Zell days.
That's
with
right.
the Zell sound. Do you feel that your playing comes from that Cleveland school?
Well, there was an emphasis on clarity, which you certainly remember. And I would say, playing with Levine as much as we did, his biggest emphasis was on clarity and rhythmic integrity. So, for instance, with the Mozart operas, there was such a variety of articulation and attention to dynamics and shape that he expected. And certainly he worked under Zell.
Correct. He did. He was one of the assistants along with Michael Cherry. And I think
Michael Cherry, right.
That's right. And he came from that same school. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Mm-hmm. Wow. So Levine was really your connection to New York.
He was. I ended up playing a lot of different things in New York. The interesting thing was one fellow who used to contract a lot of like choral groups or small opera companies. When I went to the Met full time, he said, "Oh my God, are you sure you want to tie up yourself and be in that one position?" And then, of course, shortly thereafter, things started. This little group folded, and this one that had 3 concerts a year only had 1. And he said to me, subsequent to that, "Boy, in hindsight, you did the right thing," because it was a very secure, hardworking, but a very secure position.
Absolutely. How many years were you? How many years were you in the orchestra, and then how many years were you principal at the Metropolitan Opera?
I played. Well, I was principal 19 years at the end. I was assistant principal 11 years. And then I was an extra player for 4 years, I guess, 2 or 4 years. Anyway, it was 30 years all told.
How many operas do you think you played while you were there?
Oh my goodness. That's a good question. I mean, certain ones came up, repeatedly.
Right.
But,
the top 20 probably repeated.
Know, maybe 60 different operas.
Wow, that's amazing. Larry,
something like that.
Before we get to more of this, can we hear some of your beautiful playing?
Well, I happen to have the bass over here, so I will do it.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, as long as we're talking about the opera, I'll stay in the opera realm and play an excerpt from Rigoletto, Verdi's opera. Rigoletto is the court jester to the Duke of Mantua. And of course, the Duke of Mantua is the famous role in Rigoletto, the tenor. He sings, for instance, in the last act, La Donna Mobile, which is certainly the most famous tune from Rigoletto. In the first act, though, right off the bat, the Duke sings a little ditty called Questa o Quella. This one, feminine, or that one, feminine, for me are the same as all the others around me. So you get a picture of his philosophy of life. So they're having the festivities, everything is fine until Monterone bursts in and puts a damper on things. And he accuses the Duke of having violated his daughter. So the Duke definitely practices what he preaches. Meanwhile, Rigoletto does his court gesture thing and is mocking him and everything. And he says, you know, Duke, what you did is vile, and you, he calls Rigoletto serpente, you snake, you who dare mock a father, I curse both of you. And that brings the first scene to an abrupt close. And the curse, I don't think, had much of an effect on the Duke, but it definitely knocked Rigoletto for a loop. And in fact, at some point I read, when Verdi was working on the opera, at one point, the title was going to be La Maledizione, the curse. That's how important this curse was. So what I'm going to play is from the second scene, which is a total contrast from that party festivities of the first scene. Rigoletto is walking home, it's dark, and he's a baritone. A character with a great name, Sparafucile, approaches him, and he's a bass. So you've got these two low voices. You have the first cello and the first bass playing a tune together, and the accompaniment fits perfectly. There are no violins. It's just violas, cellos, basses. There's no flutes, no oboes. It's just clarinets, bassoons, no brass. There is a bass drum, though. So our figure is basically a dotted figure, and they're playing bum, 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 bum. So you can imagine that hollowness added by the bass drum. This just is a totally creepy atmosphere. So the duet begins with the first cello and me playing this. So what's happened so far is Sparafucile has convinced Rigoletto he's not there to rob him, but he is advertising a service which he offers. He says, I'm a guy who can take care of guys. So if you have an adversary or a problem, you should speak to me. And Rigoletto's horrified to hear it, but on the other hand, based on what's just happened, he's a little intrigued, and he says, well, how much does it cost for a nobleman? This comes up in this middle section, and Sparafucile says, prezzo maggiore. I need a little more money for a nobleman. Then Rigoletto says, well, how do I pay? And he said, well, I get half up front and then the second half on delivery of the body. So Rigoletto continues to be horrified, but he's curious enough, he asks him some other things. And the music from the first section comes back as he asks him, well, how can you be so sure? How can you do this securely? And Sparafucile describes what you end up seeing in Act 3. He says, well, I just kill in town, you know, or else my sister, who's pretty and dances, lures the person into my house and I do it there. Oof. So that's happening. It's repeated up to about here and it changes. So there are a few motivic fragments as it ends, and Rigoletto says, well, okay, how do I find you if I need you? And he says, I'm around here every night, and he doesn't give him a card, but Sparafucile does remind him of his name, and he sings down to a low F, Sparafucile, and Rigoletto says, go, 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 and we play. Right at the bottom of the bass to emphasize once again the darkness of this whole scene. So
that's wonderful, wonderful, bravo, sounds beautiful. You know, this brings a good point up, Larry. The point is that, you know, most symphonies, orchestras who are playing standard orchestral repertoire, Beethoven, Brahms, Bruckner, there may be some concepts, there may be some, you know, ideas or stories, like the Pathétique, for example, of Tchaikovsky. There's some ideas and emotion that we need to learn and study and feel when we're performing and preparing. But for the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, like a great vocal coach or pianist who's working with these singers, they have to know not the gist of the story or the translations. They need to know the word for word translation in that particular language and how it pertains to the sound and the note at any given moment. And you've just displayed for us an incredible example of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra in a pit, okay, has to know this opera as well as the soprano, as well as that tenor, because you have to make your sound and your emotion in that particular measure relevant to what's happening emotionally in that story that particular time. I think that's extraordinary to get 100 plus players to all understand that. And then you talked about the flexibility of working with singers. It's just terrific.
That's true. Yeah, everything you said is true. And the other variable is that you never know when some little timing thing is going to happen on stage. They're supposed to go down a step or something, and the orchestra knows they're not going to play till they hear that 3-note pickup that they know is coming. You know, there's no automatic pilot, that's for sure.
That's exactly right. Now, I'd like to address one other thing too. In the arias, because I began as an opera conductor in Italy, and you know, as a young conductor that in those days, I remember looking at scores, and then all of a sudden I'd be working with a cast or say a soprano, and I looked at that half note that Puccini had written,
and
it was a beautiful high B, and it became like a dotted whole note. And I wasn't sure if I was doing it correctly or what was going on in my life at that point, because what happened what became first, tradition or the score?
Yeah, I know, that's a constant dilemma. And then you get the people who want to be very literal, and then sometimes the whole life is taken out of it. And I mean, there's a great Tucker story where he held like a high B flat too long, longer than what you're describing, longer than written. And Fausto Clava, the conductor, saw him and says, "You held that too long." And Tucker says, "It was a good note." You know, so, there gets to be an element of that.
I guess you got to take advantage of it when you got it, right?
Right.
Larry, would you describe, first of all, what instrument are you playing? Who's the maker?
This is a modern instrument. This is made by a fellow named Arnold Schnitzer, who for a long time was in our area of New York. And he's now out in New Mexico. He's made a total change. I'm sorry he's not nearby for repairs, you know, when we're back in New York. But it was made by Arnold Schnitzer. It's based on a Montagnana model. He has different models he makes. In fact, he makes one that's his ergonomic bass that looks like it either melted or was something out of Dali. It's not symmetrical. It's small on this side to make it, or I guess it's smaller over here so that you can get into thumb position without the shoulder in the way. So as I say, it looks like it's melted or something, and he's made several of those. And the bow is a modern bow too. This is Susie Lipkins, who's in the Catskills of New York. So I also have an Italian bass, but this is the only bass I brought because of our outdoor things. You know, Italians are very temperamental, and I didn't want there to be a problem in the park. So this is the bass I've been using this winter. Yeah.
Wonderful. Now, with all string instruments, they have different sizes, different shapes. You know, even for youth, for example, children start maybe on a half size or whatever, 3/4 size. When we say you're playing a full size bass, that's not really true. Is that correct?
No, it's usually called a 3/4. Yeah. It's everything on the bass is on such a large scale that you have to sort of take those dimensions and the practicality of getting around the instrument into consideration. And as long as you mention different things, I'd say if you go to a concert and you look at the basses, there's 3 different things you might notice different among the players. One is this instrument is a violin shape. So these corners have the point characteristic of a violin or all the other string instruments. You will see basses that have what are called viol corners that don't have this point. And there are a lot of German basses like that. And again, that's like coming from the viol, V-I-O-L side of things. This is definitely from the violin side of things. The second thing, I play what we call the French bow, which is the same held the same way as all the other strings. There is another bow, German. This part of the bow is quite a bit farther from the stick, and it lies in your hand like that. So there are a lot of advantages and disadvantages. There's a lot of leverage with the German bow, and certainly Berlin Philharmonic, all the European orchestras, at least the German orchestras, play German bow, and boy, that's some great sound. Now, Philadelphia Orchestra were all French bow. So there are advantages, disadvantages to both. The third thing you'll see, the bass has a problem with range, where at the Rigoletto I play, this is basically the lowest note, an E natural. But with Richard Strauss and different people, you started seeing a low C that was an octave below the cello low C. So I have the low C. I don't know if I'm too high in the frame. Can you see the top of the string?
We can see it. We can see it. Yes.
So the string is extended from here to here. So this is a major third worth of distance. So from E, now to play the other notes, I have to go back there and finger. So you'll see, if you look at a bass section, you'll see sometimes a fingered extension, which is what this is. You'll even see some, if I were playing more, I might consider doing this. There's like a key or a latch for each half step. So if you've got something that goes G, D, G, D, you can set the D.
Ah, okay.
So that's kind of a good solution. The other possibility, you're probably familiar with the extension machines. Right. You see the metal tubing up here. That's a little like remote control. You press here and there are these concentric rods. You press here and up here, the key goes down. Now they're noisy. You can't, you're stuck with where the key is. You can't adjust the pitch at all, of course. And then the third solution that I did for a while, and it's used in Europe a lot, is to add a 5th string on the bottom. But that gets tricky because you've got this arch so that you're only playing on one string at a time. If you throw in another string, it gets very difficult to work your way around and only play it on one string at a time, or be able to really extend it.
And because of the size of the instrument, this movement is much bigger than a violin.
Yeah, oh sure. And there's only so much room between here and here for this curve, you know.
Correct. Do you keep the extension closed and use it only when you need it because of repertoire?
Right. That's right.
If you were to leave it open, would it give it more sympathetic vibration?
Well, it's a question of which notes you want. It would help on C's and G's, but you got to have an open G that does that. I think it sounds better. You probably can't hear that, but this E will make the open E sound, will vibrate. sympathetically. So it's sort of, you pay your money and take your choice. I like feeling the string lying in exactly the same position as the others. If you open it, that top string is higher, and it's a little harder to close the notes on the bottom string. Anyway, that's the craziness of the bass, and
Love it.
called the low note problem, you know.
Love it. The first time I experienced this was with tuning, when I first got to Cleveland and started actually playing with the orchestra, subbing with them, was that Daniel Majeski, the concertmaster at the time, would stand up, give the 3 A's for winds, brass, and of course the strings.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would give his E for the bass section just by itself. All the strings, as we know, violin down to cello, are tuned in fifths.
Right.
Explain to us why he would have given us that E just to the basses, and why do you tune in fourths?
It's just a question of distances. If I start on the second string, this is a D, and I want to play a D major scale, I'll put it this way. If it's the cello, you can play D, E natural, F sharp, and G. And now, obviously, I've moved my hand. I've cheated. And then you go to an open A. Well, we have to kind of cut back one note. So I go, it's just a question of how to fill these distances without shifting too much, you know?
Now talk a little bit, Larry, about color, an example. For example, you can play the same note in the same register in different positions and different strings. Would you show us the difference? Like, for example, if a passage called for a very big, husky color sound, where would you play it?
Well, generally, if you go to a lower string, it's like, now interesting, the opening of the last act of Rigoletto is A minor notes that go. Now, and somebody who just started playing the instrument would play it here. That's not exactly the same. It's again, it's a murky kind of scene starting that last act. So
right.
that's one of the choices. Is this A is different from this A, and it's the same on all the. This is the kind of thing that my wife talks about all the time. Is it's what string you're on, because it's so much more colorful in a certain passage. It makes it much smoother.
Right, and as a principal player, you would make that decision for your section. Is that correct?
Pretty much. We didn't get too. I would say we were not too locked in as much as, say, when you spoke to David Kim, as the Philadelphia Orchestra might be. But we did, if there were a major thing like that, I would say, no, over here, over here.
Understood. Now, with the Metropolitan Library, which has got to be vast, you have scores that are probably marked by Mahler still there, or, you know, certainly these great composer conductors. Did they ever pull out like the Mahler set? Is that used, or did conductors, when they come in, did they want to use a clean score?
I don't. Some of those things are there as very interesting artifacts, but they're not used in real life. They would take too much of a beating. There is one great one though. There's a clarinet part that down at the bottom says, Caruso gave every member of the orchestra $50 for Christmas. That must have been like 1910 or something.
That would have been a lot of money.
Yeah, it was a lot of money, that's for sure. But maybe it was $5. But in any case, there's a note that the clarinetist from over a century ago put in the part.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
We have a listener who asked one question, which is very good. How do you travel with that instrument?
Oh, don't ask.
Why do bass players always have convertibles?
Yeah, right. Oh, it is such a problem. Well, I told you I started as an extra at the Met. And I would come in and out with the bass, and I got a locker. And one of the older gentlemen, once I was in there regularly, he says, "How does it feel to be a gentleman?" So that was a big difference when I could leave an instrument parked at the hall, you know.
That's terrific. I just want to make it.
I used to fly occasionally. I didn't like to do it, but you could buy a seat. You went through different protocols, like you had to have the bulkhead seat. But I haven't flown with a bass since 9/11. I haven't had to. So
Sure.
now
And when you
drive, I have a van and
wonderful. And when you're touring with the orchestra, they had those big, huge, big crates. You remember those? I mean, those are gigantic. They were wonderful sizes. There's a quick story. I don't know if you remember, Ella Shellifu was the harpist in Cleveland. I don't know if she was still there when you were there playing. And she was the only woman in the orchestra in those days out of 100 men, you know, so there was no ladies' locker room. So it was just the men's club, you know. So she told me that they used to have one of those traveling road cases backstage when they were touring, and that became her dressing room. Sure. That's how big it was. I just want to say and mention a really wonderful musician. Your wife, Judith Yancus, is an excellent violin player and played in the first violin section of the Metropolitan Orchestra for many, many years. And she's an inspiration to me when I work with her. So shout out to Judy as well.
Oh, sure. I mean, we're glad we can be doing this. And yeah, she was right at the front in the firsts and played on the first stand a lot of times because of our rotation, you know. So
right. That's terrific. Listen, Larry, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your music with me and the world. You're an inspiration.
Well, thank you. Thank you for including me, and look forward to seeing you in a hall soon.
That would be nice when our voices reverberate again. It'd be beautiful. I'll see you. Thank you for your time. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Goodbye, everybody.